Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nola Wuttunee, and I am honored to be your MC for today's gathering. Today, we are celebrating the launch of the book, Still Ruffling Feathers. Let us put our minds together and see what we can do for our children. We respectfully acknowledge that we are gathering on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and we honor the enduring presence and contributions of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities throughout Canada. We also pay our respects to the elders, past and present, and I extend that respect to everyone joining us today. To tell you a little bit about myself, I am a member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation, and as a media professional, I have over 30 years experience in the media and in Canadian journalism and Indigenous television. I was the first Indigenous person to market Indigenous produced and specialty television programming around the world. And I have worked as a talk show host, a producer, filmmaker, journalist, and news anchor for channels including CBC, ITV, and APTN. Currently, I am a media relations consultant in marketing and promotions, and I act as a mentor for Indigenous storytellers online. In this webinar today, we will hear presentations from contributors to the book that challenge, inspire, and uplift. Stories that continue to ruffle feathers in the most meaningful ways. Also, I'll be putting a link in the chat for anyone attending here today online who wishes to order the book and get a 30% discount. So make sure and order your copy. It is my privilege now to introduce my uncle, Winston Wuttunee, a renowned entertainer, elder, singer, and storyteller from Red Pheasant Cree Nation. Winston's music and performances blend cultural teachings with laughter and meaningful social messages. And he has shared his work internationally, including a performance at Carnegie Hall, one of the world's most famous concert halls in New York City. He's an educator and cultural ambassador, and Winston has received multiple honors, including an Inspire Award and an honorary PhD from the University of Manitoba. Winston will now open our session with an honor song.
We're making this movie to put in the university and to teach young people all across Canada the ways of who we are and why we are. Hey, hey. Way, hi, 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 way,
Thank you, Winston and Jerry, for that beautiful honor song. It is now my honor to introduce my sister, Dr. Wanda Wuttunee, a member of Red Pheasant Cree Nation. She holds a Bachelor of Commerce degree, a Master's in Business, a law degree, and a PhD. And Wanda is the first Indigenous person in Canada to attain that level of education. Dr. Wuttunee is a globally recognized scholar and professor emerita at the University of Manitoba. Her research spans over 37 years in Indigenous economic development, focusing on community capitalism that aligns with cultural values. She has authored and edited numerous influential works, including Engraved on Our Nations, Indigenous Economic Tenacity, and has shaped Indigenous business education nationally. Welcome, Wanda, and please share with our audience how this book came about.
Thank you so much for everyone joining in on this beautiful day. I'd like to start off by introducing a little bit about my dad, William Ivan Clark Wuttunee. He passed 10 years ago, October 31st, and this is all due to him. He started it all. I knew before he passed that I wanted to write something about my dad's legacy. And I cover a lot of his personal story in the introduction to the Still Ruffling Feathers. I got to interview him a number of times before he passed and learned a little bit more about him. I knew some of the stuff, but it was really good to dig back in. I know that he's the first Indigenous lawyer in Western Canada. He was admitted to the bar in 1955. I knew he was an activist starting very early on in his career. Also, I found out that he was kicked out of kindergarten. He tried to go there when he was 4 years old, and the teacher says, "You'll come back again next year." He won a Canada-wide scholarship to McGill University when he was in grade 12. A teacher asked if he could put the application in on Dad's behalf, and Dad won. Never having left the small community of Battleford in Saskatchewan, he took a cattle train to Montreal, and he ate when they fed the cattle. He got off in Winnipeg. He was hungry, walked down Main Street, looked in at a restaurant and figured, oh, that's too fancy for me, and we probably would call it a greasy spoon today. I also heard more about what an important influence his dad was, Grandpa James. Grandpa James enfranchised our family in 1943 and moved from Red Pheasant Reserve to Battleford. He said he wanted opportunity for his family. He did not like the jealousy and the politics on the reserve, and so they all left. Dad was also part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he went to Rome with a delegation looking for an apology from the Pope. And he loved studying languages, and he addressed a group in German because the Pope was German. He also shared his views on some issues with me, giving me a little bit of an update of how his views had changed over time, but also how some of the same issues were still needing to have work done. In 1971, he published his book, Ruffled Feathers, Indians in Canadian Society. Very articulate, eloquent position that you would expect from a lawyer. He mixed it with his own experiences living on reserve, and what he saw were challenges for his people, and really put it straight from his heart exactly what he thought needed to be done, as you would expect from an activist. So he did that. It was very controversial then, and it's still, I think, controversial in a lot of ways as well today. The full title of my book, as mentioned, is Still Ruffling Feathers. Let us put our minds together and see what we can do for our children. That's really at the heart of my book, and also, I believe, at the heart of Dad's book as well. What can we do for our children? I got to work with an incredible group of scholars who joined me, making time for this project, and we're all very busy academics, so I'm just thrilled with Lee and Peter and David and Robert and Michael. Just thoroughly enjoyed working with you. It's so important to know our history, and it is important that we be challenged in our assumptions, and I hope this book does that. I'm also very, very grateful for the unstinting support of University Manitoba Press, the board, and working with a wonderful team, Jill McConkey, Barbara Romanek, and Sarah Enns, just awesome. This was a project from the heart from the very beginning. I'm just so blessed, so very blessed. It took 10 years to finish this publication. I'm so blessed that my sister Nola and my brother Nisha walked with me from the very beginning to the very end. My sister Lori said yes to having her artwork, her beautiful artwork on my cover, Sky Around Town. And my daughter Drew designed the book cover. It was a real family affair. Now I'd like to bring my dad's voice in. We're going to see a little short clip from a show called Under Attack. It was filmed in 1970 at Brock University, and it was a few months before Ruffled Feathers came out. And he talks about his positions. The students question him, and he gives his position. So here we go.
Lawyer William Wuttunee under attack here on the campus of Brock University in St. Catharines. We're about to move to our audience microphones. Let's start at mic 1. Your question, please.
Mr. Wuttunee, you were speaking of integrating Indians into the white culture. How do you propose this integration?
I propose that if people who are on the reserves, the working people, the responsible people, are given a chance to have access to money and to spend that money as they see fit, I think we will make some good headway. Because at the moment, there is one organization, for instance, which has 14 people hired to go around speaking in a very negative manner about the society we live in. And how could you expect those people to take their place in that society? You just can't.
So you don't propose putting the Indian into the white culture, just putting him into the white culture?
No, I don't propose that. I say that they can go there if they wish at their own good time, if ever that comes around. But people should have the right to move off if they wish and fit in and work like the rest of the people do.
Okay, and just a second question. When you said earlier on that when you were moved from your culture, your Indian culture, into the white culture, that you didn't experience what was defined as a cultural shock. Now, do you know if any of your other family did, if your parents especially, or if your brother-in-law, or do you know that if other Indians were also put in the same situation, but without the support of other Indians with them, would they experience some kind of cultural shock?
I think we were one of the first to leave just several years ago, and I think that that if there was cultural shock to be experienced, that it could have been experienced at that time, because now they have friendship centers, guidance counselors, people are more aware now of people leaving reserves. And I think now it is much easier to leave a reserve and fit in. So that if any shock were to occur, it should have occurred then, back in 1943, see.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, ma'am, over on mic 2.
Mr. Wuttunee, I've seen Indians begging on a train platform in northern Ontario, and these people have been totally and utterly stripped of their pride and dignity. How can you expect a people to voluntarily incorporate themselves into such a competitive society that would leave human beings without a shred of pride?
There are a lot of there are a lot of white people who are exactly in the same boat, or in the same trash can, if you prefer. So that it doesn't make it any more difficult because he's a dark-skinned fella rummaging through the trash can. When Diefenbaker was complaining about South Africa and their apartheid policies, I can remember in the backyard of Saskatchewan Government Insurance, Indians going through the trash can. And yet Diefenbaker tried to make out that South Africa's policies were worse than ours. And they are not, of course. But the point I make is this, that if you're going to have bleeding hearts for Indians, also have bleeding hearts for your own people.
I do, sir, but I also believe that the Indians are making a fundamental criticism of our society by refusing to enter into it.
Yeah, I make a fundamental criticism of this society as well, but I am in it. and I propose to stay in it and try and change it if I can.
Okay, back to this mic. Your question, please.
Mr. Wuttunee, do you agree with the removal of the Indian land agent from the reserve itself?
The Indian agent?
Yeah.
Yes.
You agree with that?
Yeah.
You mentioned before that the Indians took advantage of the funds provided to them by the government and went into town and drank beer and got all drunked up. But don't you think with the Indian land agent there, he'd probably be a better influence?
Well, it's the Indian agent that was allowing the chief to go and drink up the money.
Mm-hmm. You said there was a lady who, hypothetically, there was a lady who complained that she wasn't having anything done to her house and it was falling to pieces. Don't the Indians elect a chief every 2 or 3 years?
Every 2 years, yes.
Can't they do anything about a chief like that? Or do they tend to stick with the chief on and on? Or?
It'll be pretty hard to remove this fellow because he's been elected into the position. Now, the only way probably is to have him arrested while he's drunk. And then point that out to the minister, and if the minister's civil servants see fit, that this man should be removed, then he may be removed. But one of the things that happens here, of course, is the civil servants protect their own position. When Kulchyski said, let's do away with the Indian Affairs Branch, he was really fighting with two groups, the Indians, Cardinal, etc., and the civil service. They didn't want to lose their position. Do you think they would voluntarily do themselves out of a job that they've had for 20 years?
Thank you, Wanda, and thank you, Dad, for your presentation. Now we'll be hearing from each panelist. I will invite them to share their insights, their stories, and reflections on Still Ruffling Feathers, and how it engages with Indigenous knowledge, governance, and cultural resilience. At this time, I'd like to begin with David Newhouse. David is a member of the Onondaga Nation from Six Nations of the Grand River and a professor of Indigenous Studies and Business Administration at Trent University. He was the founding director of the Chani Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies, where he helped launch Canada's first Indigenous Studies PhD program and developed the first People's House of Learning. An award-winning educator and scholar, his work focuses on Indigenous governance, economic development, and the integration of Indigenous Western knowledge systems. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much, David, for taking time to share your thoughts. I'm so looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you, Wanda. I'm sorry I'm unable to be there in person, so I want to, first of all, thank you for preparing this book and put it together. I think it's an immense contribution to the continuing debate about our future. Now, your father wrote an intensely provocative book that asked, I think, one of the most profound questions that one can ask about one's own society. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? How do we want our leaders to behave, right? And how do we want to treat each other? And he was writing at a time also of incredible debate about the future. At that time, words that we use today, decolonization, reconciliation, resurgence, were not part of the vocabulary. And he was talking about all of those things, right? He was also talking about sovereignty. He was talking about decolonization. He was talking about resurgence and asking questions about what does the future look like? And now, as I said, those are important questions. And he tried to answer them. He tried to talk about leaders and gotten himself into some difficulty, right? As you know. But I think what he did was important. Now, we focus a lot upon our relationship with Canada. Now, as Indigenous people, we have a long-standing relationship with Canada, one that has not gone very well. And as we move forward and as we begin to exercise our sovereignty and we begin to shape our own futures, we need to ask ourselves the questions that I talked about before. Now, what type of society are we trying to build? What do we want our leaders to do? What institutions do we want to build, right, that are going to take us into the future? And those questions are still important. They're challenging to answer. And I'm afraid that we're not answering them well today. Not that I know the correct answer, but we're not allowing ourselves to answer those type of questions. And what type of economy do we want to develop? What type of indigenous knowledge do we want to bring to the table? What are the values we want to use to educate our children? What type of education system do we want? All of those questions, right, are ones that are stimulated by what your father was trying to do. We've answered some of these questions, right? We've chosen, I think, as a direction. We've chosen to emphasize our culture and to develop our culture and our traditions. We've decided we're going to bring those into the contemporary world, and we're going to try to develop what I call indigenous modernity. And we're going to try very hard to ensure that our knowledge, our traditions, our ways of being, our ways of doing are front and center, and that they affect the structures and processes of our everyday life. And that's a difficult thing to do. It requires constant awareness, it requires constant questioning, and it requires constant discussion and debate. And we need, if we're going to do that, to be able to develop the political climate that helps us to do that. And we have to be careful, right, in ensuring that we do ensure that we can question our leaders, that we can question ourselves, that we can question Canada, and that we can find ways in which we can, as I like to say, answer the Guswanta question. How do we live well together on this land? But that means also answer the question, how do we live well within our own communities? And part of that answer is institutions, right? We develop institutions that do our thinking for us, that help us to think about these questions and then propose answers, propose solutions, propose approaches. In the economic sphere, right, we have developed a whole series of economic institutions, financial support institutions, economic development support institutions, business, impact benefit agreements, all sorts of institutions that are doing our thinking for us and that are advancing our ideas. And that's the way forward, is the development of our institutions. And that, I think, is where we need to go if we're going to continue to exercise our sovereignty and create the world that your father was helping us to create.
Thank you, David. Now let's hear from the editor of Still Ruffling Feathers, Dr. Wanda Wuttunee, on her own contribution to this work. Wanda?
Thank you. So, my career at the university was such a blessing because my research looked into the stories that we share as a community in business. Community economic development was the area that I was most drawn to. And as David spoke about all of the incredible work that's being done, it was always just such a real honor to see our resilience, to see our innovation, and usually and undoubtedly, actually, at the heart of it all was love for family and love for community and for our people. So I think that's the underlying foundation, I believe, for my work. And as I mentioned earlier, for my dad's work as well. So in this book, my chapter is called Reflections on a Legacy, an Eagle Eye Perspective. Wuttunee in Cree means eagle tail feathers, and you need tail feathers to fly. So I took an opportunity to look at the roadmaps that, I'm going to call him Bill for now, my dad, that he laid out. He charted the way forward for our people. He explored the Indian Act, and he had roadmaps for land, leadership, and economy. So, Indian Act, in Dad's words, Bill's words, the provisions of the Indian Act do not give Native people equality. They are saddled with disadvantages which hound them continually in their daily lives. It cannot be said that an Indian has equality before the law if he cannot enjoy his property and if he has to depend on a minister in Ottawa to exercise and make decisions on his behalf. The Indian Act promotes a spirit of inferiority, dependence, and coupled with the treaty mentality is one of the main reasons for the current difficult situation. Canada continues to have this problem unless definite steps are taken to change the provisions of the Indian Act or to repeal the Act completely. So Bill believed absolutely in our ability to look after our own affairs and that we should be free from any government interference hovering over us. I like that. However, it was really interesting to find out that this is really not new ground for Bill. In 1959, he presented a brief on behalf of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations to a joint Senate and House of Commons committee, which included a model Indian Act, which clause by clause with rationale for the changes that those chiefs in Saskatchewan wanted to see. Basically, it shifted authority to individuals and band councils and giving band councils powers similar to a municipality. Also, he thought that cooperation agreements between individuals, band councils, neighbors, provincial governments, and federal governments was also important. So that kind of talk was not something back in 1959. We didn't see that kind of talk about the Indian Act in that detail for a number of years later. How big is a hindrance is the Indian Act today? It's still a hindrance, but leaders have been effectively maneuvering around it and through it in many creative ways. When I was speaking to a leader, he was part of the Atlantic Congress Policy Conference of First Nation Chiefs. I said, so what about the Indian Act? And he said, what Indian Act? He talked about them building a school that should have had the blessing of the federal government, but it didn't. And when the government rep came and said, we didn't give you approval, he said, yeah, okay, what, are you going to tear it down? So I saw that in a lot of communities with visionary leaders that knew how to maneuver around the strictures of the Indian Act. It has, however, outlived any kind of use that or benefit that might have occurred. I'm not sure what that might have been, but we still have it, and it's something that I hope that our leaders will make a change soon. Next, looking at his land roadmap. Basically, he again said we need to control our own lands and have certainty of individual ownership. And his solution was a federal government fund of $1 billion to settle all claims. However, the idea was sound, but the cost was low. So the first comprehensive land claim or modern treaty was James Bay Cree in 1975, 4 years after the publication of Ruffled Feathers. So in 1971, when Bill wrote it, the treaties didn't look too helpful. There hadn't been any kind of legal decisions that supported relying on treaties. So he wanted us to work from a position of strength. And I think we've done that. For the nations with treaties since 1973, there's been 742 claims from unfulfilled treaty promises, roughly $22 billion and 8,100 square feet of land transfers for the benefit of their communities. For those communities without treaties, we've had 27 modern treaties, which have given control to these communities of over 600,000 square kilometers. And under the First Nations Land Management Act, 127 communities have developed their own land codes and operate under their own land governance system, replacing the land-related sections of the Indian Act. So the opportunities for taking control of our land to the benefit of all and the capacity building amongst Indigenous peoples has changed astronomically over these last 50 years. The work continues, but there's many more trained Indigenous peoples who are taking up that call. In terms of the leadership roadmap, David said that it was controversial. So Yes, Bill called out Indigenous leaders, government bureaucrats, and Canadians who saw us as victims requiring special treatment. Red Power was a political Indigenous movement in the 1970s for change, especially in opposition to the white paper policy statement that had been offered in 1969 by the Trudeau government. Bill had this to say about the leaders who advocated for Red Power and their vision for Indians. It is a segregation of Indians from white people, the establishment of an administration financed by the Canadian taxpayer and run by Indian organizations. It is the promotion of a buckskin and feather culture and the attempt by Indian leaders to muzzle any criticism by their fellow Indians. It is the perpetual criticism of the Indian Affairs Branch and the process of white witch hunting. They believe it is the white society which is guilty and which should pay retribution for their pain and suffering. They blame everything on the white man and the Indian agents. They don't like the words assimilation and integration, and plainly they don't seem to like anything except the white man's money. He also asked hard questions of us about the leaders that we voted for. He said, "Where is the dignity of the Indian people that we're once so proud of? Have they completely lost it? Or is there still some vestige of pride left in them? If so, they should immediately get rid of every dictator in the ranks. They should depose every racist and make sure they muzzle them adequately so that bitterness and hatred will not be further spread." There was a lot of backlash with Dad's position about integration, and he had this to say: "It is time to blast the arguments against integration to speak in favor of it. Integration doesn't have to be enforced integration. Rather, it can be a gradual process which will develop Indian men and women into independent, contributing members of Canadian society. Merely because some Indians have chosen to leave their reserves and their people does not mean they have no use for the Indian culture or for their language or for their families. They have become tired of the poverty of which they have to live and tired of the administration of the Indian Affairs Branch over their daily lives. They want freedom, a chance to live like an ordinary person, to grow old in peace and to die without shackles." Found it interesting in my research to listen to what Chief Andrew Thompson of the Manitoba Indian Brotherhood said in his submission to that joint committee in 1959. "I do not object to integration. I would like to see my children mixed in with white children more than has been the case in the past. Of course, in respect to the reserve from which I come, there has been a mixed up pattern. I was raised with white people for a long, long time. I could take you right back to the great grandfather of Chief Peguis. He was the man who helped set up the Scots colonization, and his children and his neighbors' children mixed in with the white people's children. These people are civilized. I do not want my people to turn back the clock. I want them to advance in their studies and to become something and to have good professions where they can compete with white people." So Bill pushed for a Canadian society that made room for our people to live their lives freely, wherever they wanted, solid in their own values and identity, with leaders at all levels of influence who were accountable and walked a responsible walk. He said, "The Indian people will never regain this country from the white man. They can, however, effectively participate with the white man in its full development. Indians can work with the white man in partnership to develop a country which will provide for each of our children a legacy of great value. It is not necessary to separate from the white man, either physically or spiritually. The long period of separation of the two races has now ended." That was Bill's vision 50 years ago. Personally, I like the idea of working together to make a society that values each and every person to the best of their abilities and supports that. I was really blessed to be able to continue Bill's dream with my education. I think I have grade 38, and I was able, I think, to work with young leaders that I know are going to take this country and make it a great place to live. Thank you so very much.
All right. Thank you, Wanda. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Michael Doxtater, who has a PhD from Cornell University and is the head of Sagajaway Indigenous Studios and specialist in Indigenous creative practice at Toronto Metropolitan University. A filmmaker, researcher, and educator, Michael has produced award-winning documentaries for the NFB and the CBC, and has worked extensively in Indigenous community facilitation, mediation, and leadership development. From Six Nations of the Grand River, he is a descendant of Mohawk leader Joseph Brant and a member of the Mohawk Turtle Clan. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for the gracious introduction, Nola, and I'm very pleased, and I want to thank Wanda and Nola and those who were in the background when they began to recruit people to work on the revised or the modern edition, 55 years later of Ruffling Feathers, and I was pleased to participate in that. My background is sociology, and as a social scientist, I had a lot to think about when reading Wuttunee's work. Let me just go to a slideshow here, see if I can find anything in there that's interesting for you to see. But the idea is putting William Wuttunee in time and space back in 1970 and 1960s. Those of us that lived in that time and saw what was going on both in the communities and with our people in the political organizations see something that was I classify as a syzygy. Syzygy is two entities on the same orbit around a central circle, and the knowledge syzygy is ramified in Wuttunee's writing and his social science. Now I'm going to concentrate on that because I think that's important, because this is part of our intellectual history. This is an important work in our intellectual history because it does actually document and provide a data-based reflection of the time and space that William Wuttunee was working in, and putting aside any idea that I know what he thinks or believes. I'll stick to the social science aspect of it. We can only understand what he saw by what he wrote. So there's a liberal theory that sees comfortable self-preservation as the highest good. And we've seen that ramified since the time of the political economy writing of Adam Smith way back in the 1800s, right up till the present time. There's also the social theory that has a Marxist point of view perspective that sees conflict and change as constant, and it's universal all the way back through time and space. There's always been a proletariat, there's always been a bourgeoisie, and these are unified by the social theories of today that deal with political economy. The dependency interdependency syzygy that was talked about by both David and Wanda, I think, are an important factor here too as well. That you have rural societies, which is where we come from, the idea of rural society, which is sustainable and pre-industrial or tribal, it comes from the Neolithic revolution or the creation of agriculture. And as we moved into the 1800s with Durkheim writing about it and others, we see urban society and the reinvention of the wheel. And that became the Industrial Revolution. And finally, we're into a world now that is virtual and it's democratized because of the electronic age. That's one of the reasons why you're seeing us on this webinar today, is because we're now into an electronic revolution that is changing things as well. I'm going to go back into a discussion basically of some of the elements that surrounded the intellectual perspectives that were expressed by Wuttunee in Ruffling Feathers. And you have the John Rawls Justice is Fairness that was ramified in Pierre Trudeau's Just Society and the idea of theory of justice. And you can go and examine those things because it is important to the liberal project that they see equality. And equality is an expression of liberty that is, and tolerance that is, comes out in Rawls's Justice as Fairness idea and Trudeau's Justice. They had no alternative except to provide the canon, doctrine, and dogma of liberalism that has been expressed for 170 years before that. Then we have Will Kimlicka at Queen's University, who identified liberal associations as the native associations or native people who had not acquired then the nation state status, or they had not elevated themselves to the nation state, and they were looked at as in a liberal association that must be made room for in his work. And finally, you have the Lawrence Kohlberg and the whole idea of socialization that is, again, some of the discussion that was taking place in Wuttunee's work that we saw. In Ruffling Feathers, we have a reference by Wuttunee to his defense against his personal attacks that came out, that was described by Wanda earlier as some of the background and the environment that he had to survive in. And his depiction came about because of his rejection of, say, the dogma and canon and doctrines of the so-called traditional leadership that was manifested in the Indian organizations. And this is the important feature where we'll leave aside then his personal reflections that Wanda and Nola and their family know all too well, but we'll stay with the social science aspect of what Wuttunee was writing about, which is his depiction of indigenous society. And the idea of red power in the Indian organizations is something that were political and organizational entities that assumed they had the right to make decisions for indigenous people. And back in those days, I think there were registered Indians on the Indian membership list of about 300,000 or 400,000. Now they're up around 1.8 million, but back then there was a smaller group of people, mostly rural, and like myself, who grew up on an Indian reserve, had very little contact except through high school with the non-native population. But what he does, and is an important part of our intellectual history as a social science work that needs to be studied, he provided a documented inventory of the Indian organizations and the relationship with the government in that time in 1969 and 1970. And that the idea of a choice seemed to have been withdrawn from the discussion and the dialogical engagement between the native society and the non-native society. There was no choice. You had to sign up, you had to take your kids to get them on the list in order to get them health care, education, and so on. And that was determined by an Indian agent. And the Indian agents nowadays have actually migrated into the political organizations and the band council leadership. They're the new Indian agents. So you have a continuation of what was something that Wuttunee described as being detrimental to the well-being of the native population, was the idea that somebody else had control. Somebody else had a say. And that's where that's why it's important to look at Lawrence Kohlberg and the idea of socialization. So you're being socialized to the dominant political hegemony is the phrase that we use to describe that process, where we go from the liberal idea of doctrine, dogma, and canon that looks for toleration and liberty for individuals and free will, to the idea of the social contract and the social contracts that were created by the original inhabitants of the country. Political economy is about who has the power, who says, who gets to say how the money is spent, who gets to say how the resources are used, right? And we have the syzygy again, conservatism, liberalism, and socialism all in one area, but the oil-rich versus the energy-starved. I'll just read it. The global power elites and the rural populations, fossil fuels versus food, communism versus capitalism, the good life versus comfortable self-preservation, liberty versus accountability. All of these factors are a syzygy that you can see in the writing that we examined when we looked at Ruffling Feathers 55 years later. 55 years later, what we see is in the 1970s, and I don't know if you can see the slide, but I'll just read it. In the 1970s, when Pierre Trudeau ran things, the Native Liberal Caucus identified 21 federal ridings where Natives held the balance of voting power, with their eyes on the Indian Economic Development Fund. In the 1990s, Alberta's Native Progressive Conservatives lobbied Mulroney for $3.5 million to run the Native Business Summit out of the HRDC money, the Human Resources money in the federal government. And in 1924, the AFN conservative lobby pushed for power in its deal with Poilievre, who they think will be the next PM, by voting against the $48 million that was being designated for child and family care. This is another example of feathering your own headdress, is the way I would depict that. So published in 1970, in those 55 years, we have then the same discussions taking place between who gets to decide how our resources are used. And back then, when they asked for the land claims, we have now an organized group of scholars who work and study this that say that in 1986, the Mulroney government identified the treaty debt at $11.5 trillion. So they're not talking about their money, they're talking about, that's our money, you owe us, that's a debt. Anyways, so without getting into my own spiel on it, I'll just end by saying that one of the things that we talk about is with the land acknowledgements. And 90% of Canadians live in urban centers. And that the Supreme Court of Canada has identified that underlying title to the entire country is still treaty-based. We still have title to the entire continent. And when do we get to have that discussion about the debt with those who are in power, especially now that the ring of fire is upon us again, and we're going to have the same dialogue or the same dialectical take place between who gets to say how our resources are being used. And if with that, we'll just leave you with one last thought, that in the 1st of November, I would like all of you to go and do a rent acknowledgement instead of actually paying your landlord, and see what your landlord says.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael.
Ta-da.
Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Peter Kulchyski, Professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. His work focuses on Indigenous rights, Northern communities, and the impact of colonial policies on the Dene and the Inuit. He's the author of several influential books, including The Red Indians and Like the Sound of a Drum. His latest work, Mode of Production, The Final Horizon of Practice and Theory, will be released later this year. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Nola. You're the only person who, when introduced me, managed to flub my first name and not my last name. That's quite an accomplishment, I have to say. I want to thank you all. It's a pleasure to participate in this. My chapter is called A Critical Perspective. So I come from my own perspective is a Marxist perspective, and I've been sort of in the trenches of the struggle for Indigenous and treaty rights for many years. I'm first going to say that I might be, other Marxists might wonder why I'm even doing this, why I'm writing about this book, why I'm reading it. And in the first instance, I agreed to write this chapter out of friendship for Wanda, who's a colleague of mine and a friend for 25 years. And just as she does it as a labor of love for her father, I can say that I do it as a labor of love for her. And that I appreciate the work that she does in Indigenous communities around Indigenous entrepreneurship. I think there's something very valuable to that. So I like the way that she has actually built upon her father's legacy and made it her own and made a significant contribution to sort of the discussion landscape that we have. And so that on the one side. The other thing that I would say is that it's very important that we all read books that we don't agree with and engage with views that we don't necessarily agree with. And, that's where the expression putting our minds together comes from. If we all thought the same thing, there would be almost nothing to say. It's our disagreements that are of interest. And it's always a challenge and a worthwhile challenge to pick up something that you don't necessarily think you're going to have much sympathy with, and challenge yourself and think about what's being said and where the differences are and so on. So I will say just very briefly, because I want to actually focus on the things that I found sort of more surprising commonalities than I expected when I read William Wuttunee's book. I can't say Wuttunee's book because that's also Wanda Wuttunee's book, and they're both WWs, so you really got to be specific in distinguishing them. But I will say he, in my mind, and in sort of the kind of defense he was giving to the white paper, I think he underestimated the value of Aboriginal and treaty rights, and I think he dismissed them and sort of painted people fighting for them in the light of corruption. And there was some corruption. There continues to be some corruption, but I would say the biggest corruption we're seeing in the world right now is being managed from the White House. And there has always been significant corruption in non-Aboriginal politics as well. So we just have to be. I've run into, on reserve leaders that I feel were not really acting on behalf of their people. I'll say that. And I've run into many honorable people on reserve who are dedicated and who don't get paid enough money, frankly, for the work that they do. And I see that in the mainstream society as well. But I do think that Aboriginal and treaty rights, just at the time Wuttunee was writing that book, soon after we had the Calder decision, which really changed the game about how we view Aboriginal and treaty rights and made treaty rights or Aboriginal title much more valuable and led to eventually the recognition of Aboriginal rights in the Constitution and so on. So he couldn't have seen that at his time, but he does sort of say this seems to be clinging to the past, and to me, it was not helpful, I guess, in the end. I would also say that, he has this curious oscillation because there's a deep respect for Indigenous culture, and I think he carries it with him in his bodies, and his daughters carry it with them. And but sometimes he can also be quite dismissive and, sort of see it as feathers and as, sort of just not particularly important. And he can also be speaking quite dismissively of it. So I think that, and the modernization trope can sometimes do that. It's my view, actually, that the values that Indigenous people circulate, caring and sharing, are values we need in this world more than ever before. And that there is a depth to Indigenous culture that we need in this world, I would say, more than ever. So with those things as criticisms, and that's, you can look at my chapter and find my quotations and all of that sort of stuff. I just want to say a couple of other things that what I admire in his book, and I hadn't seen that video before, and I have to say it was really moving. He's a handsome dude for starters and a feisty guy. I met him and I liked him, but seeing that video was like, one thing that he exemplifies is a value that I think is not widely circulating in our public sphere, and that is courage. And he had courage. He had the courage of his convictions. He stood behind them, and I respect that. And I think that has to be respected. And whether you have my opinions or his opinions, if you have the courage and you stand behind them, regardless of which way the currents are flowing, and the social gathering is, if you're the one person who says, I'm not going to shake hands, everyone's smiling and shaking hands, I don't think this is worth smiling and shaking hands about. That takes a certain amount of courage, and he, I think, exemplified that courage as a public figure, and he deserves recognition for that. More important for me, coming from my own political theoretical perspective, and he says it brilliantly in that little video clip, and that will remain with me, and I will cite it to my students. He says, why do you have a bleeding heart for Indigenous people? Have a bleeding heart for your own poor people. And in the book, he's very clear about the fact that he sees the potential of an alliance between the dispossessed in Canadian society in general and the Indigenous peoples who are poor. And I think that that's absolutely prescient and actually ahead of his time, and still deserves to be thought about, worked on, and dealt with. And Lee Miracle is one person, well-known poet, who spoke about the poor white people who lived around her and how she felt sorry for them and felt like there was something that she had in common, and that this wasn't just. Poverty isn't just an Indigenous issue, it's also an issue that comes with mainstream culture. But I see relatively few people among the Indigenous intelligentsia, we could say, as well as around the non-Indigenous intelligentsia who want to tackle, there are non-Indigenous people who look at poverty issues and don't necessarily see that those issues also are affecting Indigenous peoples I think that a broader anti-poverty movement that recognizes that Indigenous people are suffering from it, as are non-Indigenous people, which is something he pointed to, would have been a much more and could be a very valuable part of his legacy as an intellectual. So I think that the book is worth rereading today for the shock of it and the different ideas he's willing to propose. And, his willingness to compare Canada to South Africa is something that more radical Indigenous activists were doing in the 1980s, but I didn't hear much of that in the early 70s when I started being active. So I also found that, quite powerful. So I think that's what I have to say. I thank Wanda for putting this work and this panel together. And you could also now start maybe pushing for a reprint of his original text as well, because I think it does deserve people's attention. But I guess the very last thing I will say is that we can tell in the love that his children have for him that he had a big heart. And that also on its own, that breathes through the pages that you read. Whether I agree with his opinions or not, he was passionate about them, and that's something that I have great respect for. So thank you all.
Thank you, Peter. Now, at this time, I'd like to introduce my cousin, Robert Falcon Ouellette. He is from Red Pheasant Cree Nation, and he's an associate professor of education at the University of Ottawa, an anthropologist and a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, where he became the first Indigenous Knowledge Keeper chaplain. Robert is a former member of Parliament, and he has championed Indigenous languages, education, and reconciliation initiatives. Welcome, Robert.
Hey, me tansei Nola ikasani ikse ni makoma kontek tansei metani ta wapam te cook ni naskamin ni tetaskun aski benesio. My name is Robert Falcon Ouellette. I'm from Red Pheasant, and I appreciate that, Nola and Wanda, for all the hard work you've done to make this a reality. And editing my book chapter, I know that was not easy to do, and I apologize, and I've turned red because I really do apologize, Wanda. And Michael, I'd like to do a bit of a rent acknowledgement for you before we begin. I'd like to acknowledge on the land we meet as the homeland of the Indigenous nations who've never been fully compensated for its use. It's not only a matter of history, but it's a continuing relationship, and we benefit daily from the lands that have been taken without consent, compensation, and treaty fulfillment. So I say that in a bit of a jest, but I enjoyed that comment you made. I thought that was quite interesting, and it made me smile, and I appreciate that, Michael. But I hope you enjoy the joke back to you. So the title of my work the chapter that I wrote was "Learning to Straighten Our Ruffled Feathers in Education." I'm actually a professor of education at the University of Ottawa, and for me, it's very important. And for me, Winston, for not Winston, but William, is an extremely important person in my life. I didn't always have a chance to talk with him often, but once when I did, he always offered some really good advice and much of a mentoring role. And he asked many tough questions, which I think many are still relevant today, which has been highlighted by a number of the speakers here. What is our place in Canada as Indigenous peoples, and what does success mean for us? William, I think, was a person of great pride in the family and for many Indigenous peoples, a lawyer well known in Calgary. I have met people, and if they say, well, where are you from? And I would say, well, from Red Pheasant. And they would say, where's that? And who's from there? And I'd say, well, William, Bill Wuttunee, a lawyer. And someone would say, I know him. He's that lawyer that wears those very fine suits in Calgary. But his book, I think, Ruffled Feathers, was so important in the debates around Indigenous peoples. So important, in fact, actually, that it was in the Museum of History in Ottawa. And I remember when I was in Parliament, visiting the museum there, the Museum of History, and seeing the book actually in one of the displays on Indigenous peoples, because it actually challenged our concepts around equality, identity, and the future. But I think if we go back to around that time, I think we need to think about this debate, this great decade of debate that we were having in the 1960s and the 1970s, the late 60s and the early 70s. The white paper of Pierre Trudeau and of Jean Chrétien, the Minister of Indian Affairs. The paper, which had wide consultations just before it was introduced in the House of Commons in 1969, and it consultations with Indigenous peoples across the country, and Jean Chrétien saying, we have listened to Indians across the country, to Indigenous peoples. And then when they announced what they wanted, it was the idea of ending Indian status and treaties in the name of equality and making First Nations people exactly like all other Canadians. And it took a little bit of time, took almost 6 weeks before Indigenous peoples really understood what the government was looking at doing. And then the chiefs started speaking out and were quite angry with the government's position, eventually leading to Pierre Trudeau to retract the white paper and saying we won't shove anything down people's throats. This led to one of the strongest papers, I think, of that era. It's the Red Paper of 1970 from Harold Cardinal, which was a strong rebuttal defending treaty rights and Indigenous sovereignty. Often it's also entitled Citizen Plus. Harold Cardinal's work was one of those really important papers that anyone, if they're trying to understand where we are today, should read to gain a better understanding. And it was a very strong rebuttal of the white paper from Pierre Trudeau the first. But then William, not being one to take things not being one to let others simply lead the debate, thought it would be good to enter into that debate where he entered in with Ruffled Feathers in 1971, where he talked about integration, education, and individual agency. And I don't think William's or Bill's work really fit easily into a lot of the political boxes that we have today. While some say he was for assimilation, I don't think he advocated for that. I don't think he was for assimilation. He wasn't for isolation either. He believed that Indigenous peoples should participate fully in Canadian society and remain proud of their heritage. And I know Bill was always very proud of who he was and where he's from. And he wrote, "The new breed of native cannot look at the past as a form of defeat. Indians had great leaders in the past, and there's no reason why they could not continue to have great leaders in the future." But at the heart of all of this was the idea of education. Education was at the heart of this struggle for William. And I think he was a fine example of what education could bring through his education at McGill University and then becoming one of the first, but also one of the top lawyers in Calgary. I think, in my estimation, Bill believed that Indigenous peoples must not only control their own education, but understand both worlds, the traditional world, where our heritage is from, and also the Western world. And he wrote that while we talk about the importance of culture and language, many Indigenous peoples do not understand who we are. Students don't really know their own history, and this leads them to not knowing their own future. And Bill feared that resentment towards Canada could trap young Indigenous people in anger instead of empowerment. And I think when we saw in that clip, there was a lot of anger. And I think Bill talked about this in his book, that we cannot have a hatred of the white man because that would not bring liberation to us. Only education and engagement could. And that might seem very benign today to say we can't have hatred, but I think in some ways it was very controversial at the time, and his book was so controversial he was banned from 13 reserves. Imagine being a very proud Indigenous man who had a wonderful education and being banned from 13 reserves. Today there are still people being banned from reserves, often for some of the most some very serious issues. And we know about this that goes on across many communities where they do banishments. But imagine being banned, being one of the top people that has with very well educated, and how that made William or Bill feel. But he continued always spoke about how people need to get an education and also pull their fair share of the load in Canada. And people might say, well, we've signed treaties, the government owes us. Bill, I don't think, looked at it in those terms. He thought that everyone, didn't matter if you were participating in a traditional culture or modern society, you had to pull your fair share of the load. You had to contribute. A hunter must contribute. Everyone must contribute. It doesn't matter what you're doing in life. Everyone has to be about having pride and responsibility and the courage to bring about positive change within that society. Now, Bill has also a wonderful legacy. He helped create the National Indian Council, which was created in 1961, which actually united First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and non-status peoples together in a single organization. Eventually, though, and there's a bit of debate whether it truly happened, but the government actually eventually allowed it to be divided or forced its division by funding First Nation organizations, funding Métis organizations, Inuit organizations, and funding non-status peoples with the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. So we had the Assembly of First Nations, the Métis National Council, the Inuit Taparit, Kanatami. But this actually weakened the unified voice that he actually envisioned for Indigenous peoples. And but I will say that he has been recognized in some ways for the great work that he did. I was at the Assembly of First Nations annual summer meeting, and it was being held in Quebec City in 2008, and I was there because I was posted to the military at the Valcartier military base near Quebec City. And Bill happened to be there at the same time, and he called me up, and we got together. And then he said, come meet the Grand Chief, Phil Fontaine. And so he took me to meet Phil Fontaine. And then the next day, Phil took a moment during the assembly to honor and recognize the work that Bill had done with the National Indian Council and its overall goals. They honored him at that assembly in August of 2008. In the 400th anniversary of Quebec City, but with everyone in people watching and who were in attendance. And I thought it was actually a very moving ceremony and acknowledgement of his work, that he had not been forgotten. Now, even though critics like Harold Cardinal accused him of betraying Indigenous sovereignty, I think that history shows that many Indigenous peoples have actually followed his vision in practice. And if we look at our own community, Wanda and Nola, and Bill's community of Red Pheasant Cree Nation, of the majority of our citizens actually don't live on reserve. Most have actually moved into cities. They have been seeking opportunity and education, and they've been living Bill Wuttunee's message of integration and advancement and the ability to contribute in significant ways. So, Bill matters extremely important because he actually believes that Indigenous peoples should be full partners in building Canada, not just as subjects of policies, but as leaders in shaping its future. He also is important because he warns against this idea of self-loathing, this idea of despair and dependency, but urges pride and partnership instead. And today, as we discuss reconciliation and those ideas, Bill's ideas remind us that reconciliation is not only about redress for the past, but it's about responsibility for the future. And he asks us to dream not of separation, but of leadership, to make our children proud to walk in both worlds. So Bill Wuttunee's ruffled feathers. He ruffled feathers because he refused to fit into anyone's expectations. He challenged both government and Indigenous leadership. He insisted that freedom comes not from victimhood, but from education and pride and participation. And in many ways, we, his grandchildren, his community, and all Indigenous peoples are living out his paradox of keeping our culture alive while thriving in the modern world. And his words still echo today. We can work in partnership to develop a country which will provide for each of our children a legacy of great value. It is not necessary to separate from other Canadians, either physically or spiritually. Tapwe akiki tuam. Hai hai.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robert. And I want to thank the panelists for their thoughtful reflections. And as we go into the Q&A section, I'd like to thank instructors Jamie O'Neill and Peter Pomart for joining this event from the Asper School of Business at the University of Manitoba with their classes of more than 170 students. And thank you, students, for submitting so many thoughtful and diverse questions to include in this Q&A time. It was hard to pick which ones we would offer today, so I'll ask our panelists now to keep their answers brief so we can cover as many as possible. Okay, and for the first question from the students, what do you think is the main message of the book that is still affecting Indigenous communities today?
I think an important feature of the book is its social science scholarship, and that it's data based, and that his argumentation is based on evidence and it's based on facts, and that we should think about that when we study ruffled feathers, because it's about the binary or the dichotomy or the dialogical engagement between different ideas and different expressions in our communities right now. And it should be studied. It's actually an important piece of social science work that should be studied, not argued with, but what is he saying? What does he mean when he describes what's going on?
I guess I'll say, and I certainly implied it in what I was saying, but I think one thing that he's definitely raising is the issue of poverty as its own sort of situation that people grinds people down and needs to be addressed. And in dealing with, the broad issues, talking about culture and talking about Aboriginal and treaty rights and talking about policies at the level up here, it's always worth reminding ourselves that there's something else that's going on that affects Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and that means there's much more work to be done in terms of social justice throughout all of the groups in this country for us to achieve something that deserves to be called a just society, I suppose.
I also think that what Robert was talking about, reconciliation and the opportunity and space to have dialogue where there are conflicting opinions and not getting banished. I think, yeah, ruffled feathers does ruffle feathers. And even within my own family, it's hard to see some of the ways that he articulated it. I always thought it was like a lawyer, and he presented his case and then he pushed it as far as he could. So it's interesting, definitely an interesting read. But what I appreciate too about this book is dealing with his ideas. Didn't get kind of sidetracked with the rhetoric, but dealing at the heart of what he was putting forward. So yeah, great historical piece on Indigenous leadership.
Okay, thank you, panelists. Robert, did you want to weigh in?
No, I just think there's so many great quotes within the book. If people just do delve in a little bit, you can read a few chapters and you can find parallels to what's going on today. The debate still goes on, though I think we do the debate differently. I think we're much more quiet about the debate, and the governments don't talk openly like they did with the white paper anymore. They do things in a sournois or a much more underhanded way. They're open about doing some things in a certain way, and then other things, are they for integration, assimilation, war control? These are, and I think Bill was asking these questions, and you can see this debate has gone on for over 50 years. So it's a very good debate. And you can find great quotes of Bill if you need it for your papers or something, and go in there and grab a couple, and you can toss it in your paper and make your professors like Peter Palmart, Dr. Palmart, very happy.
Okay, great. All right. What is the single biggest barrier preventing Indigenous peoples from achieving true self-determination, especially given the historical debates about ending the Indian Act and the reserve system?
So when I thought about this question, I was reminded about an article that I was so privileged to write about Whitecap Dakota Nation. So Dakota means ally, and this is an example of a reserve community, 700 in total. I think they have maybe 400 um, of their own members in their community, but they also have other Canadians too in their community. So what was really interesting was that they were bankrupt when he was elected chief, and by he's still chief now. So consistent leadership and vision. So the visionary leadership, I think, is really critical for seeing past barriers that might stop somebody else that doesn't quite see. So I was just really enthralled with the story. So they've established land sovereignty via land code that was in 2003. So he's basically been building a way out of any of the Indian Act problems. So they have their own property taxation laws. So they're creating financial independence through taxation in their community, and so there's self-generated revenue streams from funding that funds local services and infrastructure, shifting accountability from the federal government to the local Whitecap government, prioritizing strategic economic development. So again, they're diversifying. They're not relying on the federal government to support the community because they've got a casino, they've got a big golf course, and they've got a beautiful resort. Again, inviting external investment rather than relying just solely on the federal government. Then in 2023, they enacted the self-government treaty that gives them a constitutional treaty inherent right to self-government under Section 35 and transfers all lawmaking authority for over 30 areas that would have been covered by the federal government going to the First Nation, including governance, health, and education. And then with allies, building strategic alliance and governance. So how do you do all this when you only have 300, 400 people? Building allies with their neighbors, with the municipalities, with all levels of government. So I think it's the leadership is critical for seeing past what everybody else sees as obstacles, and they hit the wall and they don't go any further. But yeah, I wanted to share that.
Well, if I can, I would say I work in the mid and the far north, so I'm thinking about rural communities that are often remote and isolated, all across the subarctic and the Arctic. And I would say, for me, it's governance really and self-government. And we need constitutionally protected self-government. And the other thing is that it can't be a one-size-fits-all model, which was the problem with the Governance Act in the late 1990s. Every community needs to work on developing a system of government that comes from its own traditions and that responds to its own needs. And then they need to be able to make the decisions that don't need to go to the Minister of Indian Affairs for, approval or for possible veto or whatever. I think they need to be able to have the authority to do the things that they think need doing. And so you can't just get rid of the Indian Act, you have to replace it. And the only thing that it can reasonably be placed with, and we're sort of seeing this, but it's a very slow process, with community by community self-government legislation that empowers them. But most of that legislation still gives the federal government ultimately the final cards. And I think we need to pull that rug away and say the First Nations can manage their affairs themselves if they're given the responsibility and tools to do it. So something like that.
Anyone else? Yes, Michael.
I saw Robert had his camera off mute there for a while, but let me just jump in. The Indian Act was created as enabling legislation that governments need to spend money and honor the treaty commitments in the 1870s. And in 1925, it was revised to become that oppressive instrument that we know right now after the overthrow of the Potlatch, the Sundance, and the Great Law Confederacies that ruled and were the treaty signatories. And so the idea is that if you get rid of the Indian Act, you're getting rid of the legislation that enables the Crown to honor its treaty commitments. And as Brian Mulroney discovered as he was going to terminate the treaty rights in 1986, and he got Department of Indian Affairs to run up the bill, it came to $11.5 trillion. And it hasn't gone down because of the way the Indian Act works, is that all of us are taxpayers. So non-natives believe, and the communications branch at Indian Affairs, how do I know? Because I work there. Indian Affairs Communication Branch teaches the Canadian citizen that we're oppressing them. We're the ones that are a burden on the poor Canadian taxpayer, when that's not true. We're actually paying our own way. We're through our tax revenues from 1.8 million people of Indigenous ancestry that work, mostly 80% work off the reserve and therefore pay tax. But that still doesn't get rid of the treaty debt, which is still $11.5 trillion. It hasn't gone down, it's about 20 trillion now. And one of the things that I think that's important about what Wuttunee was doing in Ruffling Feathers was he was actually basing his argumentation on evidence. What is the evidence? And a lot of people have gone back to school to be able to go into the government and find the evidence and say, what about the $11.5 trillion? And so the Indian Act, we got to think about that. It should be turned back to enabling legislation that allows the Crown to honor its treaty obligations to our people for the land. I'll stop there. Thank you.
The problem for me with the Indian Act is I don't think any government really wants to touch it. We see that kind of going on right now with Bill S2. It's the governments, I think, are very nervous because it leads to constitutional questions and the place of Indigenous peoples under the Constitution. If you remove it, what do you replace it with? Even the S2, very simple legislation about returning Indian status to people who were enfranchised before 1951, I believe. Extremely important, but there's a debate going on the side around 6-1 and 6-2 status Indians or First Nations people. I even have government members saying we don't want the Senate shouldn't legislate in this. We should not remove 6-2 right now. We need to study the issue more. Those are Indigenous MPs talking about that, Jaime Batiste and Gull Masti, the minister, and Rebecca Chartrand. Quite unfortunate. But this legislation, I think, is almost, it's adjusted a little bit on the sides, but everyone's kind of, I think the government's generally nervous about adjusting it or doing too much of a large change because, what will it look like afterwards? And if we make a mistake, what would it look like? And Peter talks about governance. Governance, very, very important, but systems of accountability, of holding elected officials to account within Indigenous communities. I know we all have stories about governance that doesn't work or systems that aren't working, but if you change it and then it doesn't seem to work well, how do we go back and change it again? That is the difficulty.
Can I jump in?
Jump in, please, Michael.
You have to throw Max Yalden in here. The former commissioner of the Human Rights Commission took dead aim at the Indian Act. And why is Canada so passionate about getting rid of the Indian Act? Because of the treaty debt that's attached to it. I believe that's so. And Mulroney said, $8, $9, $10 billion, somebody run up the bill, let's pay the Indians off and get our Indian problem over with. And then they ran up the bill and I have a 600-page treaty implementation plan that says, well, we got a little problem with the treaty debt here of $11.5 trillion that they calculated in '86. So there's lots to talk about, and I think that would be a fruitful discussion to have to be able to say, why is Canada so passionate about getting rid of the Indian Act?
Okay. Well, I've got time for one final question, panelists. What would the Indigenous Canada conversation look like today if Bill's roadmaps had been realized 55 years ago?
So I had a thought. We've been talking First Nations, but the National Indigenous Economic Development Board has been doing State of Indigenous Economy reports every 4 years since, I think in the 2010, I think they might have started. And probably consistently in there, they look at status, they look at non-status, they look on reserve, off reserve, they look at Métis, and they look at Inuit. And the Métis people who are never under the Indian Act are often on their economic metrics equal or great or even better than Canadians, because it's all in comparison to Canada and the rest of Canadians. So the idea of 50 years ago, if the Indian Act had dissolved, would the Métis people kind of like been a bit of a pilot project of what that could have looked like? Because they are doing very, very well. I mean, in Manitoba, I mean, there's billboards about the MMF, Manitoba Métis Federation. I mean, to be able to advertise and to support their people, I just thought it was kind of interesting, that idea that perhaps maybe that might be where we might be, could have been.
Can you describe for me what the roadmap is?
Oh, I think roadmaps were the ones that I was talking about. He had his roadmap for land, for leadership, for economy, all the way through his ideas, his opinions about the best way forward for our people.
Yeah, and I think that's a central feature, or it's inherent in what he wrote about, which is accountability, leadership accountable to the people. When he was writing it in 1970, I was in the berry patch back on the res. I was picking berries. I was a transient laborer. So was my family, and we come from the longhouse culture that William Wuttunee wrote about too, with the Confederacy. And in 1869, the band of nations in Ontario rejected the first Indian Act. They wrote a letter and said, "You have no true understanding of what we need in our communities." And then in 1870, Canada was adopted in. Now, here's the last point that I'll say I think is central to what William Wuttunee was talking about. There's 37 million Canadians. And the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled consistently that underlying title still is treaty-based. Those are the only two obstacles they're not going anywhere, and we still have title to all the land. Understand that and teach that. Now we can get to the things like fentanyl and pollution and living a quality life that I think is what is inherent in what he was talking about as well.
All right, panelists, we've come to the time where I'd like to ask you for your final comments. And just to remind everyone who's attending here today on the webinar to make sure and get your discount, click on that link that we put in the chat and pick up a copy of Wanda's book. Who'd like to start off with their final comments, please?
I just would encourage, especially students, you've heard here, and I think in the book you'll see not everybody agrees with each other, nor with my dad. And that was what it was all about. And being courageous, using the word that Peter used, to engage in discussions that might be difficult. But I think, as he also said, is that there was more commonality than there was difference than he thought originally. So I think we find unity when we start really talking through the hard issues. So I would just really encourage, especially the young people, understanding that it's okay to question. I know I had a recent discussion with a master's student using the term settler. I don't know that I ever used the word colonization in anything that I talked about when I taught. And I don't like that word settler. I don't like the division in the box. And I just think, what's your heart? What's your heart? Is it respect? Good. That's where we got to start from.
So if I could, I'll say two things. One is picking up on what Wanda said. I think, what we're seeing in the South is a breakdown in civil discussion. And so I think it's important that we emphasize there's a value to civil discussion and to respecting each other across our differences and to engaging in a dialogue that tries to touch each other's hearts and tries to, honestly confront differences, not just wash them away or not just pretend they're not there, discuss them and find the points of commonalities we can build from and do the research and do the work and to think through maybe sometimes one side is right and one side is wrong. And, that's also worth pursuing. But in a civil manner, I think is very important. That's one thing. The other thing is a very young Karl Marx once wrote that shame is anger that people have at themselves. And I think shame is a killer. And I think William Wuttunee saw shame as a killer. I think in the one thing I can recognize in the humanity of his work and of his, the him that I met, and I really appreciated what Robert was saying about him acting as a mentor and doing all that. He had a great deal of self-confidence and a great understanding that shame is something that holds people back and is debilitating, and that too many Indigenous people in our society we teach poor people to be ashamed, and I think that's a terrible, terrible thing, and that's something that I think deserves a lot more attention. So that's what I'll say. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Wanda and Nola for setting this up and working so hard on the book and to get it to become to fruition. And I look forward to seeing if there's to be a film in the future, and Nola. But I think when I look at what we have going on in the Western world, here in North America and Canada, there is a hunger for a different way of looking at the world. And I think Bill was wrong on one thing. He talked quite a lot about integration, being proud of one's culture, but I think it's actually the integration not of Indigenous peoples into Western society, but I think Western society needs to integrate more with Indigenous perspectives, because I think there is something deep and profound within the philosophy of Indigenous peoples, within the spirituality, with the understanding of our place in the world, that will make Canada a very, very strong place. And I think it would benefit our education systems, it would benefit our institutions, our governance, it would benefit people in their own health. And we've evacuated from a lot of Western society, a lot of old ways of thinking, but we haven't really replaced it with anything yet. They've replaced it with maybe TikTok and the phones and other apps, but that doesn't feed the hunger within our hearts that Peter was talking about, our hearts. And I think, so I think Bill had it a little bit wrong. It's about the integration of Western society, of Canada into the Indigenous philosophy. And the people who can lead that best here in Canada are the Indigenous peoples who have been living it and keeping those traditions alive for generations.
Robert, you got it. Lighting the fire of the seventh generation, the fifth world that's in the southwest, the sixth sun that's in the south, and the great swamp elm all talk about an Indigenous renaissance that's coming, where our knowledge about how we survived extinction is going to become important for humanity. There are 1.8 billion people, the population of the earth today, and every single one of them must start to believe that they are indigenous to one earth, or we're going to have a real problem here. And who knows how to answer that? We do. Those of us who grew up with an indigenous ne gari ne yagwana shanigo na gwari ni wanio yagwai non hawi chinio chi di sots la go wa ni se go dona odi ne gari ne yonkiawi ne yagwa jiragero. And this is what they say in my community all the time. The people of the Great Spirit are a free people who are governed by covenants made in very ancient times by our ancestors and handed down to us, their children. And these covenants protect our right and freedom to govern over our own affairs in our own way. And we consider these covenants to be a precious inheritance of our children and our future generations, and no one can take that away from us. And we say that before all you children of the Great Spirit who are with us, yet all the children of the Great Spirit who have gone before us, and all the children of the Great Spirit yet to come. Thank you.
Oh.
Wow. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us here today. We hope you carry the lessons and the stories and the inspiration from ruffled feathers and from still ruffling feathers into your communities. Thanks again. And we just thank you for being with us. Hi, hi.